Welcome to the deep dive. We're about to step into a place that feels, well, almost like a world unto itself. A corner of North Africa just layered with history, shaped by so many diverse cultures, and really unlike anywhere else.
That's right. We're taking a deep dive into Morocco today, and we're using the sources you've shared as our kind of roadmap.
Yeah.
Our mission really is to navigate this incredible historical and cultural landscape, pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising details, and just try to understand the deep significance of this region across, well, millennia.
And your sources give us such a fantastic lens, don't they?
Yeah.
Showing us everything from, the oldest human traces right up to the dynamics of the modern day.
It's a remarkable collection. It really lets us see these different eras, different influences, and reveals why Morocco has such a unique story.
Okay, then, let's unpack this. So first off, just setting the scene a bit, Morocco sits right there at the northwest tip of Africa. It's got coastlines on both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And the sources point out these key geographic features like the Atlas Mountains, the Sahara Desert, obviously huge players in its story.
And what's immediately clear, just looking at the material, is that this location isn't just about mountains and sea, it's strategically vital.
Absolutely.
It's described as a true gateway between Africa and Europe, a crucial link connecting the Atlantic and Mediterranean worlds. If you think about it, crossing into Africa from Europe by land is, well, it's incredibly difficult, except right here. Morocco's position has just profoundly shaped its history.
You can really feel that history etched into the landscape too, can't you?
Oh,
especially in the historic cities.
Oh, definitely.
The sources highlight iconic places like Fez, Marrakesh, Meknes. They're UNESCO World Heritage Sites.
Yeah.
And when they describe them, you get this picture of, like, vibrant souks, those incredible bustling markets.
Yeah, and the intricate tile work everywhere you look, the maze-like old Medinas.
Exactly, and stunning mosques and buildings just reflecting centuries of artistry.
And the sources really emphasize that in these cities, the architecture, the traditions, the arts, they aren't just relics, they're actively maintained. They're portrayed as living testimonies of Moroccan culture, with these deep ties to its Islamic roots.
And the languages reflect that too.
Right. Arabic and Berber are central national languages, though French is used widely in commerce and government. Islam is, of course, the main religion. Mosques are the sacred heart of communities. And the material notes Morocco stands out as an original Arab Islamic nation in North Africa.
But there's always that blend, isn't there, that layering. The sources mention that while Islamic culture has seen architectural improvements, city development, traditions, arts maintained, the influx of Western culture has definitely altered some earlier sociocultural standards.
It paints a picture of a culture that's both deeply rooted and, well, constantly evolving.
And that blend, that layering, it goes back much further than you might initially think. The sources take us right back to prehistoric Morocco.
Yes, and they note there's this significant renewed interest and research into this really deep past.
And it sounds like the ground there is incredibly rich. They talk about Paleolithic sites, some potentially among the oldest in the world.
Yeah, it's quite something.
Alongside local prehistoric sites, showing this continuous sequence of human occupation, stretching from the Paleolithic right up to much more recent times. It's not just a few scattered finds. It's evidence of deep time unfolding right there.
It really challenges any simpler narratives we might have about human history, The sources give fascinating specific examples, rock art sites in Figure Province, for instance. There's a newly discovered Neolithic site in Ikm mentioned. It shows how widespread prehistoric activity was, even extending into Saharan regions.
Wow.
Idrisid Province is mentioned as having sites covering all prehistoric periods. From early toolmakers using things like cleavers in places like Kafed Dir, right through to Middle Ages rock art that the sources attribute to early Berber-speaking populations. And then even evidence of later Phoenician and Roman presence layered on top.
So these different eras are literally found on the same landscape.
Exactly.
The sources also discuss the lower plains around the Great Kasbahs, showing the same continuity. Sites from the Mousterian period, then Neolithic nomad cattle breeding areas, prehistoric walled city Kasbahs with structures for defense and storage.
And even fascinating linguistic clues about early agriculture preserved in Takelhit oikonyms. These are place names in the Taklit Berber language that reveal ancient farming practices across huge territories.
That's incredible detail.
It is. And a major discovery highlighted is a Paleolithic skeleton found in the pre-Rift regions, estimated to be several 100,000 years old. Its age potentially precedes some finds in Europe and other parts of North Africa.
Suggesting what, a migration route?
Potentially, yeah, suggesting a possible route for a human migration from Africa into Europe that ran right through Morocco.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though. The sources propose this thought-provoking idea about this specific skeletal lineage, that Morocco might have been more of a transit point, maybe even described, quite provocatively, as a cultural wasteland for these specific hominids on their way north.
Why wasteland?
Because its favorable temperate climate at the time made it easy to pass through. And the scarce artifacts found with this discovery suggest maybe limited cultural development in that specific context compared to other areas.
So it's a powerful reminder that history isn't always about settlement and development.
Right.
Sometimes it's about movement.
Right. And the call from the source material for large-scale excavations, specifically targeting Neolithic remains, it just underscores how much more there might be to uncover.
And the sources draw a clear line from this prehistory to the present. They state that history gives us the background to what we see now, while prehistory preserves this deep remembrance, this inheritance of the human story in this region.
But they also note, and this is important, that interpreting this incredibly deep ancient past isn't always straightforward.
No, definitely not.
Nationalist, Berberist, Arabist perspectives. They can sometimes come into conflict when trying to claim or understand this shared heritage. Adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It certainly does. So moving forward in time, the story of Morocco is also profoundly shaped by waves of external influences, starting with traders and colonizers arriving by sea. The sources detail the arrival of the Phoenicians as early as the 11th century BC.
And initially, it seems, they were drawn by resources, right? Seeking precious metals like gold and silver from the Atlas Mountains, the Sahara, using places like tinfoil as a base for trade.
Right, but the material shows it's quickly evolved. The focus shifted to maritime trade and establishing coastal colonies, places like Catabona, Mogador, and later ports like Ceuta, Tangier, Asila, Larache, Rabat, Saleh.
These weren't vast empires at first, though.
No, not really. Small, independent city-states, often ruled by aristocratic merchants who controlled the vital trade routes.
And it wasn't all smooth sailing, commerce-wise.
Yeah.
The sources mention what they actually call shady dealings with inland Berber tribes.
Yeah, which often led to hostilities. It required the Phoenicians to use mercenary forces to protect their interests. Later, Carthage, a major Phoenician power, assumed hegemony over these city-states, consolidating control over the periphery. While the sources mention specific Carthaginian military setbacks, like Hamilcar II's Longus's defeat in the Mercenary War, they primarily highlight how these maritime powers focused on coastal control rather than deep inland penetration.
What's fascinating here is how that Punic-influenced Carthaginian culture persisted for so long. A millennium after Carthage itself fell, the sources say.
It's remarkable, and they describe these later interactions with the Berbers as, quote, single easygoing relations, primarily focused on trade. The Punic inhabitants seldom got drawn into local tribal conflicts.
Yet, even with that relative peace, the mingling of populations saw Berbers moving further inland. And that caused tensions that, according to the sources, turned some of the original highland areas, even some cities, into less productive agricultural lands.
It highlights that even easygoing interactions can have complex, unintended consequences.
True. Though the sources also point out that indigenous rulers, like the Mauritanian dynasty, later managed to establish peace with inland tribes through strategic alliances. Shows the political agency of the local populations, too.
Definitely. Then came the Romans.
Right. The sources trace their arrival and expansion starting after the Punic Wars, around 146 BCE. They achieved significant control of modern Morocco by about 40 CE.
And the primary Roman motivation was strategic, wasn't it? Protecting their southern flank.
Exactly. Their initial relations with the indigenous Berber peoples were marked by tension, even outright warfare. Roman settlement was slow, cautious. For the first 2 centuries they were there, Volubilis was really the only permanent Roman settlement of any size deep inland.
But once established, Roman North Africa became incredibly productive, described as a bucolic paradise for agriculture.
Olive oil production, the sources say, actually surpassed that of Italy itself.
Which raises a crucial question. Who benefited? The sources are quite direct here. They state the Berber population was largely disregarded by the Romans, branded as ignoble scum, their rights systematically ignored, even as Rome profited immensely from the region's exports. That exploitation without inclusion is a really significant point made in the material.
And that kind of disregard, well, it had consequences, didn't it?
Absolutely. The sources note an economic decline by the 3rd century CE. And this was compounded by the rise of powerful indigenous rulers. Figures like the Zenata chief Gaiseric, the Berber king Akil, they began carving out their own territories, effectively dismantling Roman imperial authority in the region.
It just demonstrates that ignoring the local population ultimately undermines external control.
Precisely. So the next major transformation, maybe the most significant in shaping modern Morocco, was the arrival of Islam, 7th and 8th centuries. This came with Arab expeditions under the Umayyad and later Abbasid caliphates.
The sources mention key waves of arrival.
Yes.
Expeditions led by Muawiyah, later Musa ibn Osair, and Uqba ibn Nafi.
Ooh.
But at this time, the Berber tribes weren't a unified front.
No, not at all. The sources describe them as divided. Some were actively anti-Umayyad, some were pro, many just remained non-committal. This complex internal situation led to significant Berber revolts against the Arab expeditions.
Like the founding of that Berber Kharijite state.
Exactly, at Tingis. Kharijites being a distinct group within early Islam with specific views on leadership and piety, adding another layer to the religious landscape.
The sources state that an Arab expedition around 712 did manage to crush the army of a significant Berber king, ending that particular royal state.
Yes, but the material emphasizes that the existing tribal factions and divisions actually extended what they call the colonial period, the period of external Arab dominance for over a century, simply because there wasn't a single unified Berber entity for the Arabs to fully subdue.
And meanwhile, there were internal disputes among the Arab tribes themselves.
Oh yes, quite common. Driven by competition for land, control of trade, governorships. Despite this, though, long-distance trade continued to flourish. Arab tribes settled in cities, often built by Berbers, strategically located near rivers or springs. Berber tribes either formed new confederations or were ruled by Arab deputies or ministers. It was a really complex power dynamic.
And this sets the stage for the emergence of the first major post-arrival dynasty, the Idrisids.
Right. The sources explain this began after the death of Idris I, with his young son, Idris II, born shortly after.
And Idris II is really credited as the founder.
Yes, the true founder and organizer of the first Sharifian kingdom of Morocco. Sharifian indicating descent from the Prophet Muhammad, which gives the dynasty this unique legitimacy in the Islamic world.
Okay.
After a period of internal Berber and Arab struggle, he consolidated power quite effectively, proclaimed imam at just 11, and taking decisive action like executing a rival, Ishaq bin Muhammad, when he was 18.
He took some crucial steps then, establishing the kingdom's foundations.
He did. He united various Berber chiefs by having them renew their serment de fidélité, an oath of loyalty. And he founded Al-Aliyah, the city his father started, as the capital.
What's particularly insightful from the sources about Idris II is his strategy, balancing different ethnic and cultural groups.
Exactly. His policy was quite strategic. They describe Fez, which became the capital, transforming into a double city. He specifically settled Arab families there from Al-Andalus, that's Islamic Spain, and Tunis. This wasn't just happenstance. It was a deliberate policy to build a state that incorporated diverse groups.
So by his death in A28.
Right. Through expeditions and internal organization, he'd created an enlarged and, importantly, relatively balanced kingdom.
The sources then describe a shift, with the rise of these powerful Berber empires asserting their own dominance, starting with the Almoravids and Almohads.
Yeah, but before these major empires, they touch on some Berber tribes who initially resisted adopting Islam. They mention this figure, Yahya the Wanderer, described as rather mercurial, maybe unscrupulous chief.
His actions sound quite disruptive, vanquishing cities, laying waste, stimulating a sense of freedom among some Berbers.
Yes, and he was even proclaimed a prophet figure by some followers, became a feared adversary for the existing powers.
Right, and then the rise of the Almoravid Empire is highlighted. The sources describe it as arguably the strongest Berber empire in Maghreb history.
Originating from the rigorous, newly Islamicized Sanhajan's tribe from the Atlas Mountains, their empire was vast, spanning across the Maghreb and into southern Iberia.
And how did they consolidate power? The sources mention.
A range of strategic, sometimes ruthless actions, assassinating rivals, taking influential women as concubines to form alliances, sponsoring relatives, lavishing wealth on scholars and preachers to legitimize their rule. It was a mix of force and favor.
Okay. And following the Almoravids came the Almohad Caliphate.
Yes, and the sources explain their origin was tied to a religious reform movement. They were seeking a return to what they saw as religious rigor and orthodoxy, protesting against perceived decadence within Almoravid rule.
So a reaction in a way.
Very much so. They were a dynasty with strong roots among specific tribes from the Atlas Plateaus, and their rulers consciously worked to prove their own antiquity and legitimacy to challenge the Almoravids. The sources contrast the more fragmented urban society that preceded them with the sheer scale and architecture of the great mosques built during the Almohad period. It really demonstrates their power and cultural vision.
After the peak of these large Berber empires, the later dynasties, they faced periods of significant internal strife, didn't they? And growing external pressures.
Yes, the Marinid dynasty, ruling from the mid-13th to mid-15th century, is noted as the last native Islamic dynasty, originating as a Berber tribe.
And their strategies for survival.
The sources describe them balancing power through diplomacy, expanding their influence into mountain and desert areas, and strategically founding new towns and fortifications, key administrative and commercial centers.
But they faced considerable challenges, particularly resistance from a faction linked to the deposed Almohads.
Right. And there was also significant conflict over the capital city. Fez was facing issues with urban growth and stability. A move to relocate the capital to Marrakech led to fierce conflict and, remarkably, the burning of Fez itself.
Wow, what's fascinating here is the suggestion in the sources that this period of intense challenge, this conflict, it possibly drove a brilliant cultural era for the Marinids.
It's a surprising idea, isn't it, that hardship and struggle could actually fuel artistic and intellectual flourishing?
It makes you wonder about the resilience of culture. And the sources detail lasting Marinid contributions, like a major architectural campaign in Fez mosques, madrasas, those religious schools, a mausoleum, fountains.
And they also made history by being the first dynasty to mint silver coins in Morocco. The sources even note specific details like Arabic inscriptions, the crescent moon symbol, geometric patterns.
Their military campaigns were aimed at strengthening borders, continuing efforts in Iberia against the Nasrids, usually successfully.
Usually, yes. However, the sources point to a significant defeat at Jabal Ghazouan that forced a 100-year period of retreat and resistance in certain areas, though the northern territories eventually returned to Marinid control.
Okay, next came the Saadian dynasty. The sources portray them as facing immediate, significant danger, particularly from the Spaniards, highlighted by the Morisco revolt in Spain and direct attacks on Moroccan cities like Fez and Marrakech.
Sultan Abdallah al-Ghalib is noted for extending the empire's frontiers and authority, and for impressive architectural works like the Great Saadian Mausoleum and the El Mansour Mosque in Marrakech. The sources see these as consciously linking their rule to the glorious past of earlier dynasties.
But it was under his successor, Al-Hassan al-Ez, that written records detailing internal tribal divisions began to appear, signaling weakness.
Seems so, yeah. Signaling growing internal weakness. The sources describe the era's intense religious and political climate. Impassioned sermons against Christians, calls for a lesser holy war, attacks on various towns.
However, despite this external focus, they were plagued by internal revolts. Notably, one led by the Marabuts of Tinmal, which led to the deposition of a ruler.
Yes, and the sources also mention a defeat by European forces at a place called Sheikh, and the eventual dismemberment of the empire under Al-Yazid. The sources from this period really record the Saadians' calamities alongside their wealth, chronicling the significant defeats and high fatalities of this turbulent era.
This brings us closer now to the modern period and the looming shadow and eventual struggle against colonialism.
Right. The sources identify the anarchy following the death of Sultan Moulay Hassan in 1894 as a key moment when French control became increasingly intrusive.
And this wasn't just a local issue, was it? It was tied into larger international power plays.
Absolutely. The sources highlight the 1904 convention between Britain and France, explicitly designed to sideline German interests in Morocco, then the subsequent diplomatic failure at the Algeciras Conference in 1906, that effectively gave France and Spain a green light to consolidate their grip on the coastline, presenting other powers, like Spain regarding certain areas, with a fait accompli something already done.
And this culminated in 1912, where the sources state quite plainly that Paris and Madrid effectively carved out the Moroccan colonial pie, formalizing their spheres of influence, despite Spanish protests over the details.
And what's particularly insightful from the sources here is the reality of what was labeled Spanish Morocco.
How so?
They argue it never truly existed as portrayed in colonial propaganda. It was constantly facing internal revolt. Spanish efforts required what the sources call bloody wars of pacification, heavily supported by state propaganda and the cultivation of a warrior king image for their generals, just to justify the brutal control.
Meanwhile, the French protectorate was officially proclaimed in 1912. Under the guise, the sources say, of protecting the Sultan. But it was formalized by an accord in April 1912, marking the start of formal French rule.
And the French quickly implemented an administration model similar to the one they used in Algeria, backed by a vast and rapid military invasion across Morocco.
But this was met with fierce resistance. The sources particularly highlight the resistance led by Abdul Krim among the mountain farmers in the Rif region.
Yes, this resulted in France's first major military defeat since 1870, a significant blow, and it led to some territories regaining independence for a period of 12 years. The sources also note the fate of the Sultan under the protectorate essentially retreating and eventually dying in confinement.
And France rapidly integrated Morocco into its economy, building railways, roads.
Exactly. Railways, roads, telecommunications networks, even luxury hotels and casinos, particularly around the new colonial capital, which they called à la France moderne. Basically, building a piece of modern France in Morocco. They intensified an assimilation policy in the 1930s, promoting a sultan cult that served colonial interests.
And the sources point out that forcing Moroccans into an army specifically created to protect the protectorate. That was seen as a profound insult.
Understandably so. World War II is then described as a major global upheaval with significant repercussions for Morocco. The country shifted formally to the Allied camp, receiving U.S. help with landings.
However, post-1948, French policy shifted again, reimposing earlier limitations they'd briefly relaxed.
Which, according to the sources, led to a significant upsurge in nationalist sentiment.
And this whole colonial period, the events of 1912, it raises this crucial question highlighted in the sources. The argument that the 1912 treaty establishing the protectorate lacked any real legitimacy.
Right, being simply a product of imperialist powers dividing spoils without the consent or interest of the Moroccan people and was therefore inherently void.
So the sources then track Morocco's determined march towards independence. Many Moroccans had supported the Allies and WWII with this clear expectation that independence would follow.
But the French reversal of planned reforms in 1943 only fueled the nationalist movement?
This led to the formation of key political organizations, notably the Istiqlal, or Independence Party, founded by prominent French-educated Moroccans.
And the sources mention their early actions like rejecting the pre-war system and sending this bold letter to the King of France in 1945 calling for independence, warning of a hard battle, and directly exposing the realities of colonization.
The situation escalated then into a cycle of violence. Repression of political demonstrations, French troops firing on protesters in Oujda in 1944, attacks in Casablanca,
which led nationalists to form a majlis, or council, to coordinate their efforts. French executions of nationalists provoked anti-French demonstrations, exiles, general strikes, to which the French responded with force, deploying troops in Casablanca, causing casualties, widespread detentions.
But despite this severe suppression,
the calls for independence only grew louder. They reverberated widely.
And Mohammed V, the Sultan, played a crucial role during this period.
He did. The sources note his efforts urging French recognition of independence, the establishment of Arabic press and radio under his patronage in 1948 to promote nationalist ideas, and how his stance even began to evoke sympathy among parts of the French public.
The French administration tried to marginalize the nationalists, though, offering minor concessions.
Right, but always framing the eventual possibility of independence as something they, the French, would grant on their own terms. However, a turning point occurred in March 1954 with the killing of a pro-French sultan in Tangier. That sparked further rioting and really solidified the monarchy's position. Sultan Mohammed V reemerged clearly as the champion of the independence movement.
The final push is documented clearly then. Istiqlal made a formal request for independence on August 20, 1955.
Which garnered significant international indignation and fostered this widespread unity of discontent within Morocco across different groups.
This momentum culminated in the Declaration of Independence on March 2, 1956, followed shortly by the Sultan's triumphant return on March 16.
And the sources provide fascinating details of this transition. Noting the treaty was signed in Rabat, there was military parades celebrating independence, the royal palace was formally returned to the Sultan after 44 years under French control. They even mentioned the French creating a temporary buffer zone with their own guards as the transfer of power occurred.
Powerful imagery. And one intriguing detail from the sources is a poster from the time, depicting King Mohammed V centrally. While a note from French commanders back in 1912, quoted in the sources, acknowledged how geographically impossible it was for France to effectively govern Morocco in the first place. A striking contrast, isn't it, between colonial ambition and the underlying reality?
It really is. And the sources also remind us that Moroccan guerrilla warfare against the French had persisted in various forms from 1913 to 1927, showing that resistance wasn't just political, it was military, forcing the French to use exceptional measures.
And the origins of the Istiqlal Party among French-educated Moroccans, that highlights the complex legacy of the protectorate itself.
Absolutely. And their letter warning the French king underscores their determination and sophistication.
So that brings us to Morocco today, navigating the complexities of independence. The sources describe the post-independence era as initially focused on modernization and socioeconomic development, but with the monarchy quickly solidifying its dominance over politics.
Yeah, there were initial political formations, moving from the National Rally of Free Men, FRN, to Istiqlal. But the sources detail how King Hassan II assumed direct control after the assassination of the prime minister. His reign established a modern administration and army, yet it was also marked by significant suppression of opposition and reported rights violations in the 60s and 70s.
That era saw difficulties, uprisings, crackdowns, detention camps, dismantling of the leftist opposition.
Exactly. The sources describe an uncertain balance that Hassan II maintained, trying to juggle liberal reformers and more authoritarian royalist elements, while also facing two attempts in 1972 and 1973, highlighting that his control, while strong, wasn't completely unchallenged.
And economically. Post-independence saw a mixed economy, relying on external support, agricultural policies focused on increasing production.
But challenges mounted, particularly in the late 70s. Due to global imbalances like drought, oil price shocks, and what the sources describe as mismanagement. This required external support and pointed to underlying state failure factors as presented in that source. Issues in governance itself, the behavior of the elite, and an economy structured in a way that excluded many people, making the system vulnerable.
Liberalization efforts were introduced from the mid-80s. Trade, finance.
Yes, but the sources note that the economy has overall underperformed compared to its potential, with reforms often falling short of their goals. The king's personal involvement in purchasing major investment projects is highlighted as an example of the centralized nature of economic power.
So the political landscape today, it's structured as a constitutional monarchy, but the king retains extensive powers.
Very much so. Across the military, religious institutions, legislative process, judiciary, appointment of ministers, control is also exercised over political parties and the media, and economic control remains significantly concentrated with the king and his close circle.
This concentration of power, combined with persistent inequalities, socioeconomic, regional, political, and grievances like cronyism, continues to fuel discontent.
Right. The February 20 movement is mentioned as a significant expression of this, focusing on social demands and political reform, while notably avoiding direct confrontation with the monarchy itself. However, the sources state that repression of this movement led some individuals towards radicalism.
So, while the sources describe Morocco as being ruled with an iron fist, they also note it maintained stability through a combination of traditional authority and timely reforms, like the 2011 Constitution.
And comparing Hassan II's era, marked by widespread rights violations, with Mohammed VI's new era, the sources see an increase in legislative activity and governance structures, but maybe a decrease in political rights expression, leading to frustration among civil society groups.
Regional grievances persist too, particularly among the Amazi people in the north and Sahrawi populations in the south.
Yes, and while southern provinces gained some economic autonomy in 2002, Morocco maintains firm control over the disputed Western Sahara territories, which, the sources remind us, were formerly Spanish-occupied.
Culturally, modern Morocco is portrayed as this fascinating intersection of numerous civilizations. deeply rooted themes in architecture, faith, arts, craftsmanship. They remain incredibly alive despite globalization and Western influence.
And this artisanship isn't static, it's dynamic, traditionally passed down. The sources emphasize that culture is constantly evolving, identity is fluid. Examples like the Berber tambourine or the Andalusian harp, despite debates about their precise origins, are now undeniably accepted as symbols of Moroccan culture today.
Tourism is highlighted as a vital industry for growth, for wealth.
Definitely. The sources note the image of Morocco as simply exotic has perhaps weakened over time, but it still remains a favored getaway for European tourists seeking specific experiences and sites.
Often, the sources suggest unaware of the deep layers of commodification and modernization beneath the surface presentation.
Exactly. The state and the tourism industry actively cooperate to preserve this alluring image for what they call the eye of the foreigner, involving investment in sites, careful packaging of the visitor experience, new branding initiatives, high-speed trains. They're part of this effort to manage perception and access.
And the sources point out that even the growth of tourism in Morocco is linked back to external ideas and influences dating all the way back to the protectorate era.
It's quite a long thread. Internationally, Morocco has largely maintained stability since WWII. Its relationship with France and Spain is complex. There's historical tension from the colonial era, obviously, but it's evolved into a present consensus built on mutual interests. Though some accounts in the sources suggest this relationship can sometimes be overly romanticized.
There are intelligence agreements, military exercises.
Yes, common practices. And Morocco is viewed by Europe as a crucial strategic defense buffer, particularly concerning migration flows. The sources introduced the idea that Morocco's position could be seen in terms of satellite statehood in relation to Europe, acknowledging that global dynamics meantime are changing beyond just internal actors.
Socially, a major point highlighted is the 2004 Moudawana family law reform.
A very significant revision, influenced by women's rights activists. It raised the minimum marriage age to 18, fundamentally changed divorce procedures, allowing either partner to initiate divorce. It required court mediation for wives seeking divorce, shifting from the pre-2004 system where husbands could unilaterally repudiate a marriage.
But there are challenges in implementation.
Yes, significant ones noted in the sources. Courts and lawyers have shown reluctance to fully enact the spirit of the law. There remains considerable scope for judicial discretion, leading to gendered nuances in practice. And they also note that marriages conducted before the Moudawana remain governed by the old rules.
Finally, the sources emphasize the serious environmental challenges Morocco faces.
Indeed. Climate change impacts temperature extremes, erratic rainfall, persistent drought, increased flooding, desertification. They're presented as major threats.
Directly impacting water availability, agriculture, food security.
Right. And potentially intensifying existing socio-political tensions over scarce resources. The sources stress the urgent need for sustainable development, a comprehensive governance framework integrating energy, water, agriculture policies to build resilience.
So that means actively mainstreaming climate change into policy decisions.
Exactly. Developing strategies to prepare for, absorb, and respond to impacts. Identifying interdependencies between sectors, using a trade-off approach where necessary. There's even a policy evaluation grid mentioned as a tool.
So pulling all these layers together, what does this deep dive show us? Looking across the sources, Morocco truly emerges as a land of stark contrasts, doesn't it?
It really does. The ancient urban Medina versus modern development, deep history meeting rapid modernization, the diversity of languages.
The striking generosity of its people, often noted, against the backdrop of persistent socioeconomic and political challenges.
It's described, quite fittingly, I think, as potentially the last outpost of various empires and influences that swept across North Africa and into Europe, showing how each wave just added to the foundation, creating this complex, unique blend of tradition and change that's visible everywhere: daily life, architecture, the arts.
And despite any barriers or the complexities we've discussed, the sources consistently seem to come back to the genuine human connection, highlighting the kindness of the people encountered, whether it's the geniality of waiters, the cordiality of hawkers, the humility of shopkeepers.
It reinforces the idea of Morocco as a profoundly dynamic place, vibrant, resilient, a place one source vividly describes as the Moroccan theater of the eye.
It's been an incredible journey through Morocco's deep and layered history, hasn't it? From its prehistoric origins right through to the modern-day challenges and that cultural vibrancy. Your sources have given us such a clear path to see how countless external influences and powerful internal forces have constantly shaped and reshaped this remarkable culture.
Yeah, the material shows us a culture that is far from static. It's a dynamic response to constant inputs, constant challenges, while simultaneously making these conscious efforts to preserve certain allure, perhaps particularly for that eye of the foreigner that contributes so much to its modern economy.
So, as we wrap up, let's leave you with this thought, drawn from the insights and the sources. Given the dynamic nature of Moroccan culture, its constant reshaping by external influences and internal forces, and these deliberate efforts to preserve its allure while navigating intense modern challenges, how will the very essence of Moroccan culture continue to evolve and manifest in the coming decades? What new scenes will the Moroccan theater of the eye show us next?